Award-winning journalist, author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, and host of Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman has truly done it all. And she joins me in the studio right now, all the way from New York. Amy, it is an honor to have you with me today.
It's wonderful to be with you, Marty.
So in one of your books, you said, journalists are not entertainers, we are reporters. We go to places that are unpopular. So what are some of these unpopular places you've had to travel to cover a story?
Well, I think it's more places that are not known, perhaps, but should be. I think of a country called East Timor, which is about 300 miles above Australia. Now, most people in the United States don't know about it, but sadly, it is very connected to the United States, unfortunately, through the barrel of a gun. East Timor was occupied by Indonesia in 1975, experienced one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. I went there in 1990 and 1991, 17 years into the Indonesian occupation, because that military that occupied East Timor, Indonesia's military, was armed, financed, and trained by the United States. 90% of the weapons used in the invasion were from the United States. We have an obligation to know what is done in our name. When I went there, November 12th, 1991, there were people who were peacefully protesting the killing of yet another young Timorese, and we followed them to the cemetery. There were thousands of peaceful Timorese, and the Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s marched up. I was very fearful that they were going to attack the crowd. I was with my colleague, another journalist, Alan Nairn. We walked to the front of the crowd. We held up our microphone and our cameras to show that we were journalists. We didn't think they would attack in front of Western journalists, but instead the soldiers, 10 to 12 abreast, swept around the corner, swept past us, and they just opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left, killing more than 250 Timorese. They beat us to the ground. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire. He threw himself on top of me to protect me, and then they took their US M16s like baseball bats and slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. And then they put us before a firing squad. They put the guns to our heads, and they shouted two things. They shouted politique. They were saying we were political to witness this. But that is our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And they were shouting, Australia, were we from Australia? And we knew how dangerous that was, because 17 years before, when Indonesia invaded, there were 5 Australian-based journalists covering the invasion. Timor's very close to Australia. And the Indonesian military executed them all. The final journalist, Roger East, on the day after the invasion, was reporting from a radio station in Dili, the capital of Timor, to the world. And they dragged him out of the radio station as he shouted, I'm from Australia. They shot him into the harbor with so many thousands of Timorese. So as we lay on the ground, Alan covered in blood, we made very clear, no, we were not from Australia. We were from America. We were from the same country their weapons were from. Finally, they took the guns from our heads. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never had to pay for killing the Timorese. We got out of the country, we reported what had taken place. We had failed in stopping this massacre. But when we came to the United States, we said US weapons were used. There have to be serious discussions about which countries get US weapons. A nationwide movement grew up in the United States, and in 1999, the people of East Timor voted for their freedom. In 2002, they became the newest nation in the world at an unbelievably high price, and an unacceptably high price. But this nation of survivors had prevailed. And it was a lesson to all of us about what we have to do, what we want to represent in the world. And we have to shine a spotlight as journalists and cover places that are not well known in the United States, but are connected to the United States in ways people might never have expected.
And what was that moment like for you when you were thrown down on the ground? Did you ever think, maybe I shouldn't have came to the front of this crowd, or do you stand by your choice?
We walked to the front of the crowd as journalists. We had always hidden our equipment in Timor, because anyone caught talking to a Western journalist could be disappeared, could be arrested. The danger was much more for the Timorese than for us. You know, as the moment is happening, as the guns are blazing, as these defenseless people are being killed, and as we were laying on the ground, at that moment, it is just a matter of how do we stop the killing?
Talk to me about your encounter with Bill Clinton.
Oh, yes, that was interesting.
Yeah.
So on Election Day 2000, when Hillary Clinton was running for Senate, and Al Gore was running against George W. Bush for president. Bill Clinton was still president, and he called our radio station at the time. We started on TV a year later. He was calling radio stations in New York, and we were just about to go in for our broadcast, Democracy Now! The music was swelling. Our producers were in the TV studio. I got this call. I thought, who would call at 9? We broadcast 8 every morning Eastern time, but now we broadcast, at that time it was 9. Who would call right before the show? They know not to call in, and they said, hi, White House is calling. I thought they said the White Horse. That's a famous tavern in New York.
Right.
And it's where Dylan Thomas drank himself to death. And so I said, what are you doing calling here? And so they said, the president wants to speak to you. I said, the president of a tavern at 9 o'clock in the morning? They said, the president of the United States of America. I said, oh my goodness, I didn't know if this was true. And I gave the internal number in our studio, and I thought, who knows if this isn't a hoax? But I went in, I said to the producers, hey, if President Clinton calls, make sure to answer the phone call. And I said, and think of some questions if he calls. We did our hour show, and he didn't call. So we were going out for coffee. It was going to be a long day. This was election night. You know, we'd find out who was president soon after midnight. No, actually, it happened like 5 weeks later, but we didn't know that at the time. And the president was selected, not elected, right?
Right.
If you remember, George W. Bush was selected by the Supreme Court. But as we were going out for coffee, someone yelled from the control room, the president is on the phone. It was the Alternativa Latina music show. The Latino music show was on at that point. And so I came in, and Gonzalo Alberto, the host, he was paralyzed. All the music faders were up, and you could hear the salsa music. And with the salsa music, you hear President Clinton saying, hello, is anyone there? Is anyone there? He's on the phone. So I threw my body over the control board, and I threw all the faders down, and I picked all the microphones up in the room, so the whole room was hot. I didn't know whose mic was what, but I knew we had to talk to the president. And I said, yes, Mr. President, I understand you're calling to get out the vote. And he said, that's right. And so I said, well, what do you say to people who are deeply concerned that, who may not go out to vote because they think both parties are captured by the corporations? Well, he held forth. And then I asked him about Leonard Peltier, the Native American leader who's been imprisoned for life. He was weighing whether to give him clemency. He hadn't been asked about it publicly. And then we asked him about the bombing of Vieques, the Puerto Rican island, by the U.S. Navy, and they were napalming the island, but people also live there. We asked him about the sanctions against Iraq, and then I asked him about, Ralph Nader was running for president at the time. I said, some people say you're responsible for his success because you brought the party to the right, the Democratic Party. And he got annoyed then. And he said, I find you hostile, combative, and at times disrespectful. So I said, so I only have a few more questions then. Anyway, after about 30 minutes, he got off the phone. And the next morning, I got a call from the White House. And they said I would be banned from the White House. I said, banned? He called me. I didn't call him. Why would I be banned? They said, we told you that he wanted to talk about getting out the vote. You asked all these other questions. And I said, how many journalists did he talk to? He said, like 40. I said, they all agreed? First of all, I agreed on nothing. You just said he wanted to talk about getting out the vote. But as a journalist, we have to ask independent questions. We're not handed the questions by the politicians that we cover. And they said, and we also told you he had 2 or 3 minutes. You kept him on the phone for over a half an hour. I said, my goodness. He is the most powerful person on earth. He's the leader of the free world. He could hang up if he wants to.
Right.
Anyway, that was my experience with the President of the United States. It was a fascinating half hour, something that people hope they get their whole lives.
And if they would have asked you to only ask those certain questions, would you have agreed to do that?
No, because that isn't being a journalist. Then that's being simply a stenographer to those in power. You know, they have their paid spokespeople. That's fine. But as journalists, we occupy a very particular position. It's a sacred position in American democracy. We have to hold those in power accountable. So they said he had the time to speak. In fact, I did ask him about getting out the vote, but I also asked him many other questions.
Now, in one interview, you said politicians need journalists more than journalists need politicians. What exactly did you mean by that?
Because politicians do need journalists because they do their work, but they also care about how they're conveyed to the rest of the world. And that is our job. And we have to be fair and we have to be accurate. But we cannot shirk our responsibility, ask softball questions just so that we get access. We have to ask the critical questions of the day.
And on that note, I want to ask you about Edward Snowden and the whole NSA scandal. On one hand, there's potential reform and there was raised awareness, but on the other, it created a national distrust of our government. So I'm curious to know what your view is on that situation.
It's not Edward Snowden that created the distrust. Edward Snowden revealed information
Right.
that made people deeply concerned about what is happening in this country.
Right.
You know, he said something very interesting. He's gotten political asylum in Russia. It's not the place he wanted to be. He had flown to Hong Kong, did an interview with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, gave the documents over, and he was leaving Hong Kong when the U.S. pulled his passport. So he couldn't leave Russia, the place he was just transiting through. But he said, I'm not here to promote social change. He said, I'm here simply to give information to the American people so that they can decide what they want to do. And there is no question, the documents that he has released, that reporters are now publishing and writing stories about, have provoked a global discussion and debate long overdue. Do we really want to live in a national surveillance state? If we do, that's up to the American people. But it must be up to the American people. And the government has to stop lying. And sadly, you know, there's a great journalist named I.F. Stone, a great muckraker. When he was talking to students, he said, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. Sadly, governments lie all too often. If Snowden hadn't released the actual documents, until that point, the government simply lied and said it's not true. But we now know, yes, that our emails are being read, that we're being closely monitored, that corporations willingly or not willingly, their products are being used as tracking devices for us, like our cell phones. And we have to decide what kind of government we want, what kind of democracy we want to live in.
And lastly, how do you stay grounded dealing with the daily chaos of your job, almost being killed? What inspires you to continue to do it every morning? Where does Amy Goodman draw hope when you address situations every day where there seems like there's little hope left?
Coming here to Northern Arizona University inspires me. I see all of you working so hard, deeply committed also to learning about and becoming journalists. I think of journalism as such a noble profession, such a critical profession to the functioning of a democratic society. When I cover people in East Timor or in Haiti, they can be gunned down when they go to the polls, and yet most do. In our country, most people don't vote, and yet we don't face anything like those odds. So it's so important as journalists to get out the information so people can make their own decisions. I'm inspired by the people I cover.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today. And I know you like to travel a lot, so the next time you're in Flagstaff, you're more than welcome to stop by NAZ today.
Oh, thank you so much.
And make sure you all check out Democracy Now! At democracynow.org.